Hello and welcome everyone to Building the Future Faster with Copilot Studio. My name is Stephen Fiore. I'm a principal technology strategist with Lantern. Been in the industry for more than 20 years. The bulk of that in consulting, although I took what I jokingly refer to as a brief 14-year break to work at Microsoft. Personally, I was born in New York, grew up in Dallas, spent 5 years in Japan, and the last 25 plus years in the Pacific Northwest. So I'm a little bit from all over. With that, I'll hand off to James.
Hi, I'm James Lewisman. I'm with the Markham studio of Lantern Studios. I have not been a consultant quite as long as Stephen, only 8 short years with Lantern Studios. Prior to that, I spent the majority of my career in semiconductor manufacturing as corporate IT for things like Tektronix and Electroscientific. A lot of semiconductor. Also spent a period of time working for the Department of Energy and their SharePoint team for the Bonneville Power Administration. I am not as worldly as Stephen. I am mostly a West Coast kid, but I did spend a year in the UK as an exchange student. So I can't top living in Japan for 5 years, but I did go across the pond for a little bit.
Great. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Lantern, I wanted to do a really quick introduction. It's an interesting company because it's basically a 20-year-old startup. And the way that happens is there were 3 separate Microsoft partners that decided to get together and form one larger, more capable Microsoft partner. So each of those companies became studios. And each of the studios had more than 20 years experience. So we have tremendous depth and breadth of experience, but we still have that sort of startup agile mentality. To talk to the right-hand side of the screen for a minute, and the story there is we basically cover all Microsoft technologies with 2 exceptions. Even though we have security in our other practices, we don't have a dedicated security practice. So if you're looking to implement Defender, we're probably not your best choice. The other exception is while we do a lot of work with Dataverse as part of our Power Platform practice, we don't have a dedicated Dynamics focus. So if you're looking to implement Dynamics CRM or Dynamics Business Central or something like that, again, we're probably not your best choice. Except for those 2 things, we pretty much cover the rest of the Microsoft technology stack. The agenda for today, I'm going to do some quick Power Platform, Copilot Studio, conversational AI overview just to kind of level set, make sure we're all on the same page. I'm then going to kind of go through the demo, what the scenario is, what the solution is, what the architecture is, and then I'll hand off to James and try and have the bulk of the time be him showing you Copilot Studio firsthand. And then James will hand back to me at the very end to say a few things about art of the possible and next steps. I will warn you that we had an interesting situation today where the demo gods did not smile on us, and we had a regional issue with our demo environment. So James wasn't able to get in. So I'm going to, it worked on my machine for some reason. We're in 2 different regions. So the demo may not be as smooth as we would prefer because he's going to have to do everything remotely through my machine. So I just wanted to warn you, this experience is not optimal. I think we may end up re-recording this afterwards. So if you go back and watch the recording, or if you're watching the recording now, hopefully we'll be able to edit in the smoother demo where James can actually get to things directly. With that, we wanted to do a little bit of getting started. So I'll let Allison launch a couple of polls on your level of experience with Copilot Studio and your where you are in your journey and what your role is. And then as well as that in the chat, when you're done with the polls, if you wanted to put, what do you hope to get out of today? Or, if you have any questions up front about Lantern or Copilot Studio, please feel free to put those in the chat. And again, we'll try and be responsive as we go and cover as many as we can. And if we can't cover it, then we'll at least kind of do a call out and identify it for follow-up. And with that, if you wanted to start launching those polls, if you already haven't, Allison. Hopefully you can see the first poll question there.
And we're seeing the results in the chat.
Excellent.
78% of people having some general knowledge.
16% have never heard of it, and 5% use it every day, which is an interesting mix. I'll give everyone just another second to do the second poll question on where you are in your journey. And Allison, again, if you kind of want to talk through these real quick.
Yeah, looks like most people are just kicking the tires at 64%. Gearing up for implementation, 14%, and ready to go right now at 22%. So good mix as well.
Excellent. Okay. And then the last question is your role in the organization.
And this theoretically is going to make a very cute word cloud, but again,
Interesting.
We'll see.
Give everyone just another minute since this is a typing question and not just a multiple choice. Oh, actually, we're starting to see a few things come in already.
A lot of developer, great. We got analysts, we got architects, we got software engineers, database developers.
Again, an interesting mix.
Director
In the
of
interest of
Insight.
time, I'm going to go ahead and submit this so that we can get on with the deck.
Sounds great. Thanks for handling polling for me.
Oh, no worries. And again, if anyone has any questions, again, if you could put them in chat and we'll try and take those as we go. So for every solution, there is a problem. There are a couple of problems that led to the whole low-code movement and Power Platform in particular. The first is, surging demand. There are several studies referenced at the bottom of the slide that talk about the fact that there's going to be a need for 750 million more apps over the next 5 years. And the counterpoint to that is there's also not enough developers. It's estimated that we're going to need about 4 million more developers to be able to produce those 750 million new applications. And that's really compounded by the fact that as an industry, we really struggle to educate and train professional developers fast enough, which leads to companies having a real challenge trying to find the talent that they need. So if over demand and undersupply led to Power Platform, let's talk a little bit about some of the other value triggers, because typically when we talk to customers, they have one or more of these things that you see on the screen right now. I'm not going to cover all of them individually. This is a Copilot Studio briefing, not a Power Platform briefing, but I did want to highlight a couple of quick things and maybe address these in some groupings. The first is the very traditional environment that this came from, where you'd have a power user that needed functionality and IT didn't have the capacity to be able to deliver it. So they went off and they created a really complicated spreadsheet, or they went off and created an access application for their department to use. And the challenge was that you then ended up with mission critical business logic and data that the IT department had no visibility into. And heaven forbid somebody left the organization, suddenly there was no way to often be able to reproduce that or understand what had been coded. So the Power Platform's ability to let IT see what's being created, to control who has access to it, and to control and secure the data and business logic that's involved is a huge value driver and a huge trigger for folks to start moving towards Power Platform. The other scenario in here that I want to talk a little bit about is low-code development isn't just for low-coders. In a lot of scenarios, we run into this idea of fusion development, where you'll have professional developers that want to move faster. And if 80 or 90% of their application can be done in low code, they'll do that in low code, and then they'll spend the bulk of their time in the areas that are require a deeper level of expertise. So it's not an either or. There's lots of scenarios where pro developers are using low code tools. And the last one I'll quickly talk about, and I apologize if I'm talking fast, but I'm trying to get to the demo as quickly as possible. So when it comes to modernizing applications and extending line of business systems, the scenario that comes to mind is we have a customer right now that has a legacy ERP system that was so heavily customized that they could no longer upgrade it. That's actually a fairly common scenario, or at least one that I've run into several times throughout my career. So this organization wanted to do something different this time. They're implementing a new ERP system, but they're not just doing that. They're also standing up a Power Platform Center of Excellence. And the idea is that now, when they get their new ERP system in place, if someone needs some additional functionality, instead of diving right into a customization, it'll go into the Center of Excellence. The Center of Excellence will produce a PowerPoint app or a Power BI dashboard or report or a Power Automate flow. And maybe most importantly, this inventory of things that have been created are publicly exposed to the organization. They're planning on building something called a satellite app portal, so that as users need functionality, they can see what functionality has already been created and reuse that. So again, they can still be very responsive to their users while not crippling the ERP system with a bunch of customizations. So if you have a heartbeat, you've probably heard a lot about AI in the last year, its promise, its potential, how it's going to change, the industry and the world, and how users interact with computers. So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to pivot towards, this was an opportunity for Microsoft to take this low-code movement and combine it with AI to produce something that would enable even the smallest organizations to take advantage of these powerful new conversational AI tools. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the history of conversational AI, it's actually been around for a while. The first generation of conversational AI was vendors that would employ data scientists and professional AI developers that would produce these sort of out of the box conversational applications that were designed for niche scenarios like help desks or support centers, things like that. The next movement in this was when those conversational AI tools became available in-house. So now, you had developers that could produce things, and because an in-house app requires much less effort than a production app, they were able to move faster, and also they knew more about their business, so they were able to cover more topics and weren't limited to the niche scenarios that the packaged application supported. Next, Microsoft came along with Power Virtual Agent, and this was great. It provided a low-code way for subject matter experts to be able to start creating these conversational interfaces. Much less code than the professional custom development. Still a little bit tedious. You sort of had to hard code these decision trees in a very deterministic way. But again, you had subject matter experts that can now extend those topics even further. And then we get to Copilots. And the best way for me to explain how Copilots has fundamentally changed this is to give you an example from a case study that Microsoft presented at Build. And this was for a large movie theater chain in Canada. And during the day, they rent out their theaters to businesses for executive functions and things like that. And the way the process works is when you sign up for this, you get this huge document of all the terms and conditions and rules and regulations and additional services offered, et cetera, et cetera. So what they wanted to do was create a website where they could allow people to ask questions without having to go through a human that understood everything that was in that document. And they did something incredibly simple. And this is something that, with a little bit of luck, knock on wood, James will be able to show you in the demo. And this is, they just pointed Copilot Studio at this document. And now folks can go in and ask questions and get answers back on the document. And even more powerful than how quickly they were able to create that is the fact that now, several times throughout the year, that document changes. And anytime someone goes through and edits that to add new services or change some of the rules or conditions, the very next user that goes in is going to see the updated information. So it's not just about how quick it was to create initially, but it's the fact that it reduced maintenance programming down to practically zero. Which brings us to Copilot Studio. James is going to spend the bulk of the time of this showing you Copilot Studio. I did want to mention a couple of quick things. First is it's built as software as a service. So there's no infrastructure to install. There's not a lot of things that you have to do. You can go to the website and start creating Copilots right away. The second is this idea of conversational orchestration. Copilot Studio, in addition to conversational AI, still has Power Automate. So you can do things like, when somebody asks a question, you can go to data source 1 and get some information, and then use that to go to data source 2 and ask an even more specific. And then at the end of this, come out with an answer that's more comprehensive and potentially nuanced than if you were just asking questions about a single data source. And it's out of scope for this discussion, but I did want to mention that Microsoft has started talking about Copilot agents. And the idea here is that you can create a copilot that has the agency to act on behalf of a given user. So just like a user could come in the morning and check their email, and if they see an email with a certain topic or from a certain user, they may take an action. A copilot agent will be able to do that on their behalf, and it'll be able to work through these conversational orchestrations and have some long-running orchestration with some context and things like that. So again, not something we're going to cover today, but definitely something to keep an eye on, especially for those 5% of you that are using Copilot on a regular basis. A few other quick points. one of the key benefits is how rapidly you could start taking advantage of conversational AI and large language models. It doesn't require a huge training curve. It doesn't require even a lot of experience. It does require some understanding of meta prompts, which James will talk about later, but it does give you a very quick entry into conversational AI. The next one is it's actionable. It's not just about asking questions and getting answers. You could have copilots that when someone asks a question, it generates a result that then creates an email or updates a line of business system or creates a spreadsheet or updates a file somewhere. So these copilots can be actionable. It's not just about the traditional conversational, Q&A kind of format. The other element is Microsoft's been focusing on security for 25 plus years. They've been focusing on responsible AI for 15 years, and you benefit from all of that. All of that is baked into Copilot Studio. So you can create copilots that meet compliance requirements, that are secure, that respect privacy, and even compensate or allow you to control some aspects that are new to applications in the sense of conversational AIs that can potentially use violent or sexual content. There's controls built in that allow you to throttle that up or down to make sure that you're meeting your business needs. And the last point on this is the 1,200 plus connections. Some of those were developed for Power BI, some were developed for Power Apps, but as a member of the Power Platform family, Copilot Studio has access to all of those. So some of the scenarios that I was talking about before, where you're querying different data sources, you can query databases, you can query file systems, you could query web applications, you could query cloud services. Again, if it's in the 1,200 plus APIs, you can incorporate it into the conversational AI interface. I'm definitely not going to spend too much time on this slide. The real takeaway from this is, even though copilots are only about a year old and Copilot Studio even less, there are already 10,000 organizations that are using Copilot Studio today. So I really encourage you to go to Microsoft.com and look in your industry, maybe even look in your industry for organizations of your size, and see what your peers and competitors are doing to leverage this to, again, differentiate themselves or increase their efficiency or their impact. The last thing I'll mention before we get more into the demo is one of the lessons that Microsoft has started really embracing, and something that we learned personally and somewhat painfully at Lantern, is when you're talking about copilots, you should really be talking about use cases. So on the left-hand side of the slide, you see some use cases, at an industry level. On the right-hand side, you see them at the departmental level. What's important to take away from this is, when you begin your Copilot journey, to think about what are the use cases that are going to get the maximum benefit from this. It's better to have 1,000% improvement in efficiency for 10% of your users than have 100% of your users using something that they're only getting 1% of the benefit from. Moving on to the demo scenario. So the situation here is there's an organization called Lantern Financial. They have an internal knowledge base and other systems that they use for their live human agents to answer questions. They wanted to create a self-service chat bot, and their goal was to do two things. First of all, reduce the number of human agents required, but also increase customer satisfaction. It's a great customer experience when you can ask a question and get the answer that you're looking for. It's problematic when you ask the question and then ask another question and then ask another question and ultimately get redirected to a human agent anyway. So those were the two goals of the scenario. So why was Copilot Studio for this? It's basically about all the things that you don't have to do with Copilot Studio that you would have to do with a traditional application. I talked about the fact, and James is going to show, that you can connect this to documents, document libraries, databases, all kinds of other data sources, external websites with virtually no integration work. You don't have to go through what you would have with Power Virtual Agent with this sort of tedious deterministic dialogue pathing with hard-coded responses and manual topic creation. So again, Copilot Studio it makes this scenario much easier to attain. So what is the solution? Copilot Studio was used to connect to a number of back-end systems to be able to generate the kinds of answers that they were looking for. The middle section of this slide talks about something we'll touch on at the very end in terms of art of the possible. They're an organization that was sort of doing this for the first time, so they started with the easy scenario. There are some logical next steps that were not included in this demo, but would likely have been things that Lantern Financial would have done if they were a real organization. And the last thing that I'll mention here is when we originally built this, in order to satisfy that customer service improvement, we built in some sort of custom sentiment analysis. It was interesting. We did that a few months ago when we originally built this demo. Since then, they've added a number of sentiment analysis metrics to the analytics dashboard. So if we were doing this today, we might not need to do anything custom, but we left it in the demo because if you do have some advanced sentiment analysis kind of functionality that you want to build in that goes beyond what's in the existing dashboards, we wanted to show you that that is an option. It falls into that sort of fusion category that I mentioned a little earlier, but it is absolutely possible. In terms of the architecture of this, we wanted to keep it as much as possible in the Power Platform family. So we created the home page as a Power page. The Power page has a chat bot that connects directly into Copilot Studio. And from there, it can go in a number of directions. One of the things that James is going to show in the demo is a chart. That chart is not a static image. We actually make a call out to Quick Chart IO. We pass it a data file and it dynamically generates that in real time. So, if this was a real organization, you wouldn't have to update that image every day or something like that. You can just pass it the most recent data and generate on the fly. Across the middle of this is kind of that Fusion Pro Code area where you'll see some things in the demo where we talk about, how to access Azure OpenAI and Azure Search and Azure SQL. And then across the bottom of this, we have the Power Automate that I talked about, as well as AI Builder, going through Dataverse and being able to generate Power BI reports.
As Stephen mentioned, we are demoing a financial services company. This is it right here, Lantern Financial. This is in fact a Power page. So we are leveraging that as a company portal, and we have embedded a Copilot. So let's start by asking it a couple questions. We go ahead and cheat here and just cut and paste. All right, we got some answers. Fantastic. Well, let's ask some more complicated questions and see if we can't get some more interesting results. Now, there we go. As Stephen had mentioned in the presentation, this is not in fact a graphic, and we'll take a look at how this is configured when I go into the actual Copilot itself demo. This is in fact an adaptive card. So how about a call to action? We've embedded a little bit of call to action here. Okay, as you can see, we asked it a couple of financial questions. We got some responses. As Stephen had mentioned before, Copilot has changed. Historically, if this was a virtual agent or a Power virtual agent, we would have needed to define all those topics and those potential chains directly in the Copilot itself. Let's switch gears and take a look at the Copilot. You can see here, we have our overview and our topics. Now you can see here that I have a couple here have been configured. For example, our call to action, where we pre-configured it with our custom web page. And we also have our performance over period. In fact, we are not hard coding a image itself. This is in fact an adaptive card. So just an example of how we can call web services and generate dynamic data. So where is the rest of these answers coming from? Well, a couple of different places, quite honestly. First and foremost, it's primarily using generative AI. And generative AI comes in several different flavors of configuration. Now, this has changed a little bit. This is new. This is now the Knowledge Center. This is where we configure our external data sources for our generative AI bits. And we can do these more than one way. The way we want to do it now is actually configure these all directly in this knowledge source. This becomes a central repository for reuse on any topics that we configure manually. And you can see here, that we have a number of different options, things like public websites, things like SharePoint. And yes, we do see an answer that, or do see a question about multiple websites being available in, and the answer is yes, you can configure multiple SharePoint list libraries as repositories for these generative answers. We also have a whole host of other things like Azure, things like Salesforce, things like Oracle, things like SQL Server. This is in fact new, ServiceNow, and even custom connectors for our own data. Let's go into like the really interesting piece now. Where is this generative AI coming from? It's coming from here, this one. This is our conversation boosting. This is a system topic. We configure it to answer questions where we have not already manually configured a topic. And we have a number of data source choices. While we're looking at the data source choices, let's look at something else. We can give it custom instructions. You can see here, this is an example of custom instructions. I'll try to zoom in here, make this a little bit bigger. We can tell it a tone. We can tell it how we want it to answer. We can tell it how to display the answer. For example, here we have a limit to 4 rows. We can include a call to action, and we can also tell it specifically, do not provide a call to action that refers to competitors, and do not use bullets, and do not directly phrase document titles. So that's an example of custom instructions here. We've also configured it with a couple of different data sources. We've configured it against bankrate.com and First Tech Federal. These are what we get some of those answers that I asked those initial questions. We can also configure it here. Now, we have more than one choice in our knowledge topic. We can upload documents, we can link to SharePoint listed libraries, we can point to SharePoint libraries, connected files, etc. And we can also leverage Azure OpenAI services. And I'll give you a quick example of what that looks like here. Here you can see we have a deployment name, an API version, this is required. And then this 3 topics determines how many discrete pieces of information it uses to respond, the number of tokens, and then these 2, temperature and top P. These are essentially very similar. These define how broad or narrow it's going to decide to determine that generative AI. And Microsoft does recommend that you play with these independently, and you can get more information about these topics here. So just going to do a quick segue into that OpenAI services. We can see here that we configure OpenAI. There are a number of different generative models. We've used in ChatGPT-4 as a large language model. There is a host of other capabilities when you configure that model. We've also configured a Copilot OpenAI demo, Azure OpenAI Copilot, an associated search service, and an Azure SQL database for this data. So the reason we did this, we really wanted to demonstrate the ability that when we use generative AI and we're pointing it to an external source, we don't have as much control over the specificity of those generative answers. If we want to have if we're in a very regulated industry, or we want to have very specific control over those answers, we can configure it using Azure OpenAI. It's a little bit broader a topic than we have time for today, but we did want to just demonstrate that this is a capability that is built into your Copilot Studio. So let's take a look back into topics as well. So as we mentioned before, the majority of our answers are coming from generative AI, and we've actually chosen specific paths when we want to tightly control, for example, our call to action or our calling our web service for a adaptive card as a graphic. Now, this is the more historic way to do things, but there's actually a new feature in Copilot Studio as well. And that is use Copilot to create your Copilot. We can see here that we can actually use Copilot to generate topics on our behalf. So let's go ahead and see what it does. Let's go ahead and create a topic right now. I'm going to name my topic check accounts. And just like I did in the instructions for the responses of my Copilot, I can give it additional information that's going to inform that Copilot of what it creates for us. Let's go ahead and see what happens. Okay, look at that. We've got a bunch of potential trigger responses, a bunch of potential answers, and we can actually edit with Copilot and modify our terms using plain text, plain language, and allow the Copilot to do this work for us. As we look in our topics, and we will talk a little bit about the analytics in a second. Now, the analytics are somewhat of a new feature. We did this actually before that was available, and we baked in sentiment testing. So sentiment testing was we wanted to see a tone of response. Another thing we want to illustrate with the sentiment testing is the ability to leverage Power Automate in your responses. We can actually, in the context of a Copilot's response, we can actually send something out to Power Automate and leverage all the capabilities of Power Automate, even including running Power Automate for desktop to do more very technical or very specific things like calling PowerShell scripts, calling shell scripts, calling Python scripts, etc., returning a value and then returning that value back to the Copilot as a response. Now, with the new analytics engine, we have found that we no longer need to do that. We do think it's an important note to be aware that you absolutely can leverage Power Automate and the whole capabilities of all the Power Automate and all the connector infrastructure to do very specific things with this. There's also a new feature which also leverages the Power Automate capability, which is called agents. We can actually have our Copilot act as a virtual agent on our behalf and do things like respond to emails, leverage Power Automate, call Power Automate desktop, all kinds of stuff. I'm gonna let this guy run here for just a second or two and hope it comes up. This one is parsing quite a bit of data, even in a lighter data set like this, but you can see here that just looking at these topics, we can see our number of sessions, our engagement rate, our resolution rate, escalation, abandon, customer service attention score, engagement, session outcomes, et cetera, as these guys structure and render. You can see that there's quite a bit of baked in data, and this requires no additional work on your behalf. These are just built into the Copilot Studio. Another thing we'd like to illustrate is the fact that this is a multilingual capable application. Go over to here into our settings. And we can look at things like our integration tools, our generative tools. We can actually upload languages. I will call out this, and Microsoft does make this explicit at this point in time. Generative answers are English only. So we absolutely have the ability to configure it with multilingual capabilities. We are not currently able to leverage those multilingual capabilities in the context of Copilot Studio. But seeing as the pace of change, seeing the responsiveness of Microsoft, I expect it to change in pretty short order. Going back to the Copilot details, we go ahead and close this. And I think that was what I wanted to summarize for you guys today.
Microsoft has started talking about copilots in 3 different ways. One is in product copilots. These are sort of out-of-the-box experiences like Copilot for M365. The other is sort of this customizing Copilot, which is where Copilot Studio falls in, where you're really looking at, connecting to a line of business system or something like that, or doing some light customization, or pointing it at, document sources like we talked about in the demo. And then at the other end of the spectrum is sort of the creating copilots or this deep customization where you go into something like Azure AI Studio. And again, like we talked about with Fusion development, it's not an either or. You can certainly, have some low code and some pro code, and then expose that so that when somebody goes into their Copilot for M365, they'll get answers from your custom Copilot in addition to the built-in Microsoft Graph-based Copilot. Lantern Financial started with the external open model because it was the quickest to get to market and to start getting value from their Copilot Studio work. The next logical step would have been to allow users to log in and have the authenticated experience. And then also, in parallel with that, they could have started rolling out internal copilots where, again, someone could go into Copilot for M365 and ask a question about finance or HR or marketing or sales or manufacturing and get back answers on that, even though those are not things that are typically represented in Microsoft Graph. So in terms of next steps, excuse me, if you're ready to dive in, you want to do Copilot, you want to do it today, we created something called a quick start. It's a 2 to 4 week engagement. It starts with an envisioning workshop where we kind of go through and sort of level set and talk about some best practices, example by industry of different kinds of Copilots. We talk about your business challenges. We start narrowing that down to some use cases. We then start prioritizing use cases and looking at the sweet spot of, what's the high impact, high visibility, low technical complexity scenario. And then the rest of the engagement is basically building that out. So at the end of the engagement, you get a production proof of concept or a lightweight pilot that actually shows, not just what the use case was, but, it's working and how it works. And the idea being that from there, you can engage us to build more of these or to take this all the way to a production implementation, or you could take what you learned from this and go off and start building these on your own. If you're not quite ready to dive in right away, we also offer a free option, which is basically the envisioning part of that quick start, just without the building part. So we still go through and talk about your business challenges and organize those use cases. But at the end of this, we basically produce sort of a matrix that says, by use case, this is the technical complexity, this is the business value. And then we use that to create a sort of prioritized roadmap of, what we would recommend in terms of what order to start building these out. And again, you can take that and move into an engagement, or you could take that and, start working on it on your own. But the idea is this is sort of a very lightweight way for folks to sort of wrap their heads around, where copilots can be used in their organization and where they should get started. And the last option, this is more of an FYI than it is a call to action. But Lantern is starting in August to offer these Copilot Studio in a day. It's essentially a sort of complimentary training. If you click on that register today, it'll take you right there. If you're familiar with the lanternstudios.com website, you can also go to the events section there and see this as well as other complimentary training events that we offer. With that, I just want to thank you very much for your time and patience. And if you do have any questions, we'll hang on for a little bit. And look at that, amazingly enough, we finished right at the top of the hour. So thank you again.